Jesus often uses agricultural examples to allow us to find our way into new meaning of life, faith, new meaning into the entire message that he wants to unveil for the people, and finds ways to do that sometimes in language that sounds so common and so plain that we're wondering if there's really anything there to listen to. That might be exactly what was happening to the disciples and the rest of the crowd as they gathered on the shore and Jesus taught them in parables. And then when the parables were over, the people looked at each other and said, I guess there's something we should have learned from all of that. And they went on their way, probably thinking lots of different things, and actually probably should have thought a lot of different things. I've talked oftentimes that in parables, one of the beauties of them is we don't all hear the same thing because we don't all enter the parable in the same way. But in this instance, Jesus and his disciples again are together, and they say to him, maybe you could give us just a little more insight into what it was you were talking about. You're talking in parables an awful lot, and I think that you think we completely get everything you're saying, and sometimes we might need a little help here. And so when he has his disciples gathered, Jesus then goes into a little more detail on this parable of the sower. And so as we were looking at that as part of our scriptures for the week, I have to admit that with the parable of the sower, that I, and maybe some of you, really enjoy getting to the end of it. When we hear those words, that those who take the word and they put it into action in their life, that they produce that fruit, some 30-fold, some 60-fold, some 100-fold. And a lot of times we can feel that way because of where we are. We're sitting in church oftentimes when we hear this parable read, so we already know we're the good soil people. We already know that we've got to the end of the parable and we should be the examples for the rest of the world. But if you're like me, you also know that you don't sit in worship 7 days a week. And sometimes this parable might hit you different ways in different days of the week. I know it certainly does me. And so when I hear Jesus unveiling his interpretation of the parable that he has shared with the people, I spend a little more time understanding that Jesus might be speaking to me more than sometimes I even realize. And so in that second paragraph, as we hear this parable, we hear these words, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown. And I have to think for myself. There are times I have opened my Bible and I have read it diligently, and I have understood very little. There are times when I have heard other people talk about their faith life, and I realize that it doesn't really sink in for me, and I'm not really sure where they're coming from. There are even times where I have sung a hymn, and I know that the person who wrote it with a deep sense of theological conviction, and I sing the hymn, and when it's over, I think to myself, what were they actually trying to say there? And I wonder if I'm the person who doesn't understand the word sometime, if I'm the very person who realizes that that seed has been trying to be sown in me, and it's like I'm this hardened path and it just bounces off and is useless because I didn't understand the word. And that was only a little troubling. But this is what I read later, that after we say we don't understand it, it says the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. And I realize I don't want the evil one anywhere near my heart. I want to do whatever I can. And to be honest, I don't even really mind if the evil one circles around me at times. I'll even give them my left arm on occasion if they want to. I just don't want the evil one anywhere near my heart, because it's my heart that's connected to my soul that's supposed to be connected to God. And it actually is a little bit frightening to think that somehow that's where the evil one is trying to get to. It's trying to get into my heart so that I don't feel what I am intended to feel. When that hits me, I realize that there's work to be done. That somehow I continue to turn myself over to God in new ways. I think that's what we were hearing from that passage in Romans that Vicki read for us, that we have this law of the law, and then we have this law of the Spirit, and we have this sense of duty, and we have this sense of grace, and to find out where it is that God is trying to encounter us in all of that. And we hear that the law of the Spirit of life in Jesus Christ has set us free. And sometimes I have to realize that it's not all up to me. Sometimes I turn myself over to God's goodness to keep the evil one away from my heart. And sometimes I might not have that strength myself, but I know that God is strong enough. And that would be okay if the parable ended there, but unfortunately Jesus went on with all kinds of new seed. And so I paused to listen a little more closely to the rest. So when I paused to closely listen to the seeds that fell on rocky soil, I was a little bit struck, particularly by the words, on account of the word. That's what we heard. It was that the seed fell on rocky soil, but that we were struck by persecutions on account of the word. That is, persecution came because of the word. And that's not how it's supposed to work. The word is supposed to be setting me free. I'm supposed to be a person of the word, and that should be life-giving to me. So when Jesus talks about being persecuted because of the word, I started to wonder, what does that mean? Could that mean that Jesus knew that sometimes being a follower of Christ, being a Christian, would not always bring with it shining accolades? That sometimes people of the world would not understand what being a Christian was all about. And then the labels would come. And we would find out what those labels are, and we'd have to engage them. Fair or not, labels can have a damaging effect, even on our spirit, even to the point of seeing people pull away from the church because labels sometimes are too much to overcome, especially when they're put on us by others. Being a follower of Jesus is exciting, particularly for somebody who's new in the faith, but when you start being labeled, it can exhaust you and can cause people to pull away from you, and in turn, you might pull away from your very life of faith. And Jesus goes on. You'd think it'd get better, but it hardly does for a while. The seed that falls among the thorns is very interesting. Sometimes the pressures of life actually drive a person toward the church. We know that happens because a life of faith and a life in the church can provide resources. It can provide compassion and a community that walks alongside you. But sometimes it's also those very aspects of life that attempt to bring you away from a faith community. They're the same types of things that bring you here that interfere with your staying involved in a church community. Life has pressures that come with it. And sometimes these pressures well, they become dominant. Sometimes they overcome our best intentions. They demand so much from us that sometimes it feels like we just don't have much left to give, particularly to something that seems rather voluntary, like the church. I think Jesus was well aware of the pressures in his day and is still aware of what happens in our lives today. When I think about that, something growing among the thorns or the weeds, if a portion of your lawn is something like a portion of my lawn this summer, you know that the grass is having a very difficult time. But somehow the weeds seem to be doing just fine, even to the point of choking out the grass that is struggling so hard. And so now, it might seem easy or even self-serving to consider ourselves the seed that fell on good soil and is now producing this great fruit. And truly, that's how it is a lot of the time. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes my heart is being attacked. Sometimes I'm being labeled. And sometimes the pressures of this world seem like they're too much to overcome. And sometimes Paul writes to the church in Rome, and he says, if Christ is in you, then the body or all these things of the world become dead because of sin, but the spirit of life that is in you, that becomes righteousness. That's what we can hang on to. We can hear it when God calls us to something extraordinary. We can hear it when God calls us to be strengthened in our life today. We can hear when God actually wants protection over us so that our heart is turned to God, so that the labels don't distract us, so that the cares of this world don't overwhelm us. But what we must do is not stop listening. If you have ears, Jesus says, hear this. Just hear this. You are good soil. You are people of God, and you can produce fruits untold because Christ is in you, and that spirit of life is righteousness. Amen.